James Carter sat in his old wooden chair, staring out the window as the winter wind whispered against the glass. The house was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, like a thick fog settling over his heart. He could hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that once blended into the background of life, but now felt like a reminder of time slipping away. It had been 3 years since Sarah passed. 3 years since laughter filled these rooms, since the aroma of fresh-baked bread drifted from the kitchen, since the warmth of another soul sat beside him at the dinner table. Now it was just him. James Carter, 72 years old, a retired teacher, with nothing but memories to keep him company. He ran a hand through his silver hair, exhaling deeply. He had always been a man of reason, a man of logic. He spent decades teaching young minds about literature, philosophy, the great thinkers of the past. Yet, for all his wisdom, he had never truly prepared for this emptiness, this question that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. Does my life still matter? James had always believed that purpose was something you created, but lately he wasn't so sure. The days stretched out endlessly, each one blending into the next. He woke up, made coffee, read the newspaper, took a walk, and then sat by this very window, watching the world move on without him. He wasn't depressed, at least not in the way people often spoke about it. He was simply waiting, but for what, he didn't know. Then, one evening, as the rain tapped gently against the roof, the phone rang. An unfamiliar sound in his house, almost foreign. He hesitated before answering. "Grandpa?" The voice on the other end was hesitant but unmistakable. Lucas, his grandson. It had been months since they last spoke. James straightened in his chair. "Lucas, what a surprise. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," James said quickly. "It's good to hear your voice." There was a pause, a kind of weight behind the silence. Then Lucas spoke again. "Grandpa, do you think someone's always listening to us? I mean, even when we think we're alone?" James frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. "I suppose that depends on what you mean." Lucas sighed. "I've been learning about something, about stillness, about how sometimes when everything is quiet, we can hear things we never noticed before." James felt a strange pull in his chest, an old feeling he hadn't visited in a long time. Curiosity. That phone call was the beginning of something James never expected. A journey into the silence, into the unknown, into the one thing he had been avoiding his entire life, listening. But listening to what? And more importantly, what would he find when he did? If you've ever felt lost in the quiet, if you've ever wondered whether someone or something is still listening, stay with me. This story might just change the way you hear the world, and if it speaks to you, if it stirs something inside you, consider supporting this journey by liking, subscribing, and sharing this message. Sometimes, the words we need the most aren't the ones we say, but the ones we learn to hear. The rain had started to fall, a slow, steady rhythm against the roof, filling the house with a sound that James had come to know well. It was a lonely sound, the kind that reminded him of all the nights he spent sitting in this same chair, watching the world outside move on while he remained still. He hadn't expected the phone to ring. It had been weeks since anyone had called. The sharp chime startled him, breaking through the quiet like a voice in an empty room. He hesitated before answering, his old hands gripping the receiver as if it might disappear if he didn't hold on tightly enough. "Hello?" His voice was rougher than he remembered, like an old radio signal cracking through the static. There was a pause on the other end, then a voice, hesitant, familiar. "Grandpa?" James straightened, his heart doing something strange, something unexpected. "Lucas?" "Yeah," the boy said almost uncertainly, as if he wasn't sure he had dialed the right number. "I hope I'm not calling too late." James glanced at the clock on the wall, though he hadn't really needed to. Time didn't hold much weight in his life anymore. "Not at all," he said quickly. "It's good to hear your voice." Another pause, this one longer, heavier. James felt the weight of it settling between them, stretching across the distance, filling the spaces that had been left untouched for too long. Then, finally, Lucas spoke again. "Grandpa, do you ever feel like someone's listening even when you're alone?" James frowned, not at the question itself, but at the way it was asked. There was something in his grandson's voice, something unsteady, searching. He leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Lucas exhaled, the sound barely audible over the rain. "I mean, do you think there's someone out there? Not just people, but something bigger. Like we're not really alone, even when it feels like we are." James had spent much of his life answering questions. He had been a teacher, a man of facts and reasoning, someone who believed in logic and structure. But this was different. He thought of the nights he had spent sitting in this very chair, staring out this very window, waiting for something he couldn't name. He thought of the silence that wrapped around him like an old coat heavy with time. He thought of Sarah's voice, the way it used to fill the house, and the way sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could almost hear it again. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer now. "I used to think I did. I used to think that life was just what we made of it. But lately I'm not so sure." Lucas was quiet for a long time, but James didn't rush him. He could hear the rain in the background, imagined his grandson sitting somewhere, maybe near a window like he was, watching the world in the same way. "I've been learning something," Lucas finally said, "about stillness, about how sometimes, when everything is quiet, we can hear things we never noticed before. I think I've been afraid of it. The silence, I mean. But now I'm starting to wonder if maybe it's not empty at all. Maybe it's full of something. Maybe we just never learned how to listen." James felt something shift inside him, something small but powerful. He had spent so much time avoiding the silence, fearing it, resenting it. But what if Lucas was right? What if silence wasn't empty at all? For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to fill the space with words. He let the quiet settle, let it breathe between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, lighter, steadier. "Maybe you're onto something, Lucas." His grandson let out a soft chuckle, relieved. "Maybe." They sat in silence, for a moment longer, just listening, to the rain, to the quiet, to the presence of something they couldn't quite name, and for the first time in years, James didn't feel alone. That night, after hanging up the phone, James sat in his chair for a long time, staring out the window. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a hush that stretched through the house. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet, the heavy, suffocating kind that had followed him since Sarah's passing. No, this was different. It felt expectant, like something unseen was waiting to be noticed. Lucas's words echoed in his mind. Maybe silence isn't empty at all. Maybe we just never learned how to listen. James had spent years filling the silence with distractions, music, television, the rustling of newspapers. Even when he was alone, he found ways to avoid the quiet, as if it were something dangerous, something that might swallow him whole. He never stopped to wonder what it was trying to say, but tonight something had shifted. He stood up, turned off the lamp beside him, and walked slowly through the dimly lit house. Each step creaked beneath his weight, a sound so familiar he had long since stopped noticing it. The house wasn't silent after all. It spoke in its own way, whispering through the groan of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant hoot of an owl outside. He reached the back door and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, fresh, with the scent of wet earth. Somewhere, in the distance, crickets chirped, their rhythmic song blending with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. James closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he simply stood there, listening. At first, his mind resisted. It filled the space with thoughts, memories of Sarah, worries about growing older, the lingering ache of loneliness. He let them come, let them drift through like passing clouds, but he didn't hold on to them. Slowly the thoughts settled, and something else emerged beneath them. A presence. A stillness that wasn't just an absence of sound, but something more. It was then that he heard it. Not a voice, not words, but something deeper. A rhythm, a pulse, something that felt as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. It was the sound of existence itself, the same force that made the leaves tremble in the breeze and the stars burn in the night sky. He had been searching for something, some sign that he wasn't alone. And now, standing in the quiet, he realized. It had been there all along. The universe had never stopped speaking. He had simply forgotten how to listen. A deep breath filled his lungs, slow and steady. He felt the cool air expand inside him, then release into the night. He was still here, still breathing, still alive. He opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. The clouds had drifted apart, revealing a stretch of stars, endless and quiet and full of something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something. He didn't feel like time was slipping away from him. He simply felt present. James turned to go back inside, his body lighter than it had been in years. As he reached for the door, he paused, looking back once more at the night sky. He didn't need answers anymore. He didn't need certainty. For the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't empty, it was full. The next morning, James woke up with a strange sense of clarity, the kind that didn't come from an answer, but from knowing the right question had finally been asked. The night before had been unlike any other. He had sat with the silence, truly listened, and for the first time he didn't feel like he was fighting against it. He wanted to understand more. As he sipped his coffee, he remembered the small temple on the outskirts of town. He had driven past it countless times over the years. A quiet place nestled between the trees, its wooden gate worn by time. He had always been curious but never had a reason to stop. Now something in him urged him to go. The drive was short, the morning sun casting long shadows over the narrow road. When he arrived, the temple grounds were nearly empty, save for a few monks tending to the garden. The scent of incense drifted through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of pine. He stepped through the gate and took in the sight of the old wooden structure, simple yet strong, standing as it had for decades. An elderly monk sat on the temple steps, his saffron robes draped loosely around him. He watched James approach with a gentle, knowing smile, as if he had been expecting him. James hesitated, unsure of what to say, but the monk simply gestured to the step beside him. James sat down, the wood cool beneath his hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was open, inviting. James found himself exhaling, releasing something he hadn't realized he was holding. Finally, he turned to the monk. "Can I ask you something?" The monk nodded. "Why is silence so heavy?" James's voice was quiet, almost as if he was afraid of breaking the stillness around them. "I've spent years trying to escape it, to fill it with anything I could. But last night I sat with it, really listened to it, and it felt different, almost alive." The monk smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Because it is." He gestured toward the trees that lined the temple grounds. "Do you hear that?" James listened. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping birds, just stillness. "I don't hear anything," James admitted. The monk nodded. "Exactly." He paused, letting the thought settle before continuing. "Silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of everything. But most people spend their lives running from it, afraid of what they might hear." James let the words sink in. He had spent years thinking silence was a void, a cruel reminder of what was missing. But what if it was never empty? What if he had simply never learned how to listen? The monk picked up a small teapot and poured tea into a delicate cup, the liquid swirling gently before settling. "The mind is like this," he said. "At first it is restless, always moving, always looking for something to grasp onto. But when we allow it to be still, we see things clearly. We hear things we have ignored." James stared at the cup, watching as the surface of the tea grew still, reflecting the sky above. He thought about Sarah, about all the nights he spent, listening for her voice in the silence. Maybe she had been there all along. Maybe love, like silence, was something that never truly left, only something we had to learn how to hear. The monk handed him the cup, and James took it carefully, feeling the warmth spread through his fingers. He took a sip, the earthy taste, grounding him in the moment. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was searching for something. He didn't feel lost in the quiet. He simply felt present. James left the temple feeling lighter, though he couldn't quite explain why. The monk's words lingered in his mind, weaving through his thoughts like threads in an unfinished tapestry. Silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of everything. He had spent so many years fearing it, pushing it away, drowning it in distractions. But what if the silence had never been empty at all? As he walked along the dirt path leading away from the temple, the wind stirred, rustling through the trees. He paused, watching the leaves tremble in response, their golden edges catching the late afternoon light. It wasn't just movement. It was a conversation, one he had never taken the time to notice before. He closed his eyes and listened. The say. Wind shifted again, curling around him, cool against his skin. It carried the scent of pine and earth, of autumn settling in. It whispered through the branches, a sound so gentle, so familiar, yet one he had ignored for so long. And then, suddenly, he remembered. Sarah used to love the wind. She would stand outside on breezy days, eyes closed, arms slightly outstretched, letting it wrap around her like an old friend. "The wind is always talking, James," she used to say. "Most people just don't know how to listen." His throat tightened at the memory. He had dismissed those words back then, brushing them off as the kind of whimsical thought Sarah often had. She was always attuned to things he couldn't understand, always sensing something beyond what was visible. He had admired it, even if he had never quite believed in it himself. But now, standing here, feeling the wind press gently against his back, he wondered if she had been right all along. The wind had never stopped speaking. He had just never been still enough to hear it. James opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. The clouds moved lazily across the vast blue, shifting effortlessly, unhurried. Everything was in motion, the trees, the air, even time itself. He had spent so many years feeling stuck, trapped in the weight of his own thoughts, convinced that he was standing still while the world moved on. But he wasn't. He was part of this, just as much as the wind, the trees, the sky. He was still, here. A deep breath filled his lungs, and as he exhaled, something within him released, something he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. The loneliness, the sorrow, the feeling of being left behind, it drifted away like leaves carried by the wind. He looked around, noticing everything with a strange, new clarity. The way the light filtered through the trees, the way the earth felt solid beneath his feet, the way the wind moved not just around him but through him, as if it had been waiting for him to finally listen. For the first time in years, he whispered into the breeze, his voice barely more than a breath. "I hear you." The wind stirred, again playful this time, lifting a few fallen leaves into the air, carrying them away. And James smiled, knowing, truly knowing, that he was not alone. James sat at his old wooden desk, the late afternoon sun spilling through the window, casting long golden streaks across the room. A blank sheet of paper lay before him, waiting. He hadn't written a letter in years, not since Sarah. She had been the one who believed in letters, in the magic of words passed from one heart to another. She always said that writing made thoughts real, that once something was put into words, it became part of the world, in a way that silence never could. He picked up his pen, rolling it between his fingers. What did he even want to say? How could he put into words something he had only just begun to understand? He let out a slow breath, then placed the pen to paper. "Dear Lucas, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night. You asked me if I believed that someone was always listening. At the time I wasn't sure how to answer, but now I think I finally understand. For a long time, I thought silence was my enemy. After your grandmother passed, the quiet felt unbearable, like an empty space too vast to ever be filled again. I tried everything to drown it out. Books, music, even just the noise of the television in the background. Anything to make the silence go away. But no matter what I did, it always crept back in. Then the other night after we talked, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat in the quiet and listened. And do you know what I found? It wasn't empty at all. It was full. Full of the things I had been too distracted, too afraid to hear. The sound of the wind in the trees, the steady rhythm of my own breath, the quiet hum of a world that had never stopped moving, even when I thought I had been left behind. I went to a small temple outside of town. An old monk there told me that silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. I didn't understand it at first, but as I sat there, drinking tea, watching the steam rise and disappear, I realized he was right. The world has always been speaking to me, Lucas. I just never knew how to listen. I thought about your grandmother a lot these past few days, about the way she used to stand outside on windy days, eyes closed, arms open, letting the breeze wrap around her like an old friend. She used to tell me that the wind carried messages, that it whispered things we were too busy to hear. I never believed her. I do now, Lucas. I want you to know something. You were right. We are never truly alone. Not in the way we think. The wind, the silence, the stillness, they are full of something. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's something greater than both. But whatever it is, I have felt it. And now I know that I will never be alone again. Thank you for calling me that night. You didn't know it then, but you gave me something I didn't realize I had lost, a reason to listen, a reason to be still, a reason to understand that I am still here, that I still matter. Take care, my boy. And the next time the wind brushes against your face, listen to it. Really listen. It has more to say than you think. With love, Grandpa James set the pen down, reading over the words. A strange sense of peace settled over him, a quiet understanding that felt as natural as breathing. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope and placed it by the door ready to be mailed. As he stood, a breeze slipped through the open window, ruffling the edges of the paper still left on his desk. James smiled, closing his eyes, for a moment, letting the wind move through him, and in the stillness he heard everything. James sat in his chair by the window, the same place he had spent countless hours lost in thought. But today the silence around him felt different. It was no longer something to escape, no longer a reminder of what was missing. It was a presence, steady and whole, wrapping around him like an old friend. He glanced at the empty chair beside him, the one Sarah used to fill with her laughter, her stories, her warmth. For a long time that emptiness had felt unbearable, but now he understood. Sarah had never truly left. She was in the wind that brushed against his skin, in the hush of the morning light, in the quiet wisdom of stillness. She was in every breath he took, in every moment of awareness. The letter to Lucas had been sent. James knew his grandson would read it, and, in time, understand its meaning. He had spent so much of his life teaching lessons from books, but this was the lesson he had never expected to learn himself. That silence is not absence, that stillness is not emptiness, that the world, in all its quiet ways, is always speaking if we are willing to listen. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of his own breath. The same breath that had carried him through all his years, the same breath that connected him to everything. He smiled. He was still here. He was still alive. And for the first time in a long time, he was not waiting for something else. He was simply being. In today's world, where noise fills every moment, we often fear silence. We reach for distractions, for endless conversations, for anything to fill the spaces in between. But what if, instead of running from the quiet, we learn to embrace it? What if, in those moments of stillness, we could hear the things we were truly meant to hear, the gentle wisdom of the wind, the steady beat of our own hearts, the quiet reassurances that we are never truly alone? If this story has touched you, if it has made you pause even for a moment, I invite you to carry its message forward. Take a moment today to sit in stillness, to listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart. And if you find something meaningful in that quiet, share it. With a friend, with a loved one, or simply by holding on to it in your own way. And if this story has resonated with you, consider supporting this journey by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Sometimes the most powerful things are not the words we speak, but the ones we take the time to truly hear.